All right, buckle up, buttercups, because you're about to get a front row seat to the most gloriously petty act of suburban defiance this side of the Mississippi. My name's Barry, and my life in the oh-so-prestigious Prestige Lakes Estates was, shall we say, about to get a whole lot wilder. And it all started with pickleball. Yep, pickleball. That gentle, geriatric sport that sounds like a flock of angry woodpeckers attacking a plastic ball. Apparently, our HOA, led by the iron-fisted Priscilla, decided our community was desperately lacking in this particular form of recreational activity. And where did they decide to put these hallowed courts? Why, on a sizable chunk of my perfectly good, slightly overgrown, by choice, mind you, backyard. So there I was, a few weeks after that fateful HOA meeting, knee-deep in my soon-to-be former backyard, now sporting a fetching pair of oversized waders. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and impending doom, for the HOA, that is. I was meticulously adjusting a hand-painted sign stuck precariously into the mud. It read in bold, slightly uneven letters, "Official designated wetland habitat. Do not disturb, under penalty of snapping turtle displeasure." I even added a little cartoon turtle with surprisingly menacing eyes. Artistic license, you know? Suddenly the air crackled with the distinct sound of Priscilla's power-walking sneakers, a sound that sent shivers down the spines of neighborhood squirrels and probably small children. She burst into my backyard, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Flanking her were the usual suspects: Bob, the HOA treasurer who looked perpetually constipated, and Susan, the secretary whose main contribution to meetings was agreeing with whatever Priscilla said. "Henderson!" Priscilla's voice could curdle milk. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger, adorned with a disturbingly large gemstone, at my sign. "What in the name of meticulously maintained landscaping is going on here?" I calmly adjusted the sign, making sure the turtle's gaze was sufficiently intimidating. "Morning, Priscilla. Just putting up some official signage for the newly established Henderson National Wildlife Preserve." I even gave her a little salute with the hammer I was holding. Bob scoffed, a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. "Wildlife Preserve? In your backyard? You've got to be kidding me." "Precisely, Bob," I exclaimed, spreading my arms wide to encompass the vast wilderness of my slightly larger-than-average suburban lot. "Biodiversity is crucial, you know, and my humble abode is now a vital stopover for migrating, well, various creatures." I wasn't entirely sure what creatures migrated through Prestige Lakes Estates, but various sounded suitably official. Susan, ever the echo, chimed in, wrinkling her nose. "But those weeds, and that pond, it's attracting mosquitoes. Think of the West Nile." I gestured dramatically towards the knee-high grasses swaying gently in the breeze. "Those aren't weeds, Susan. They're native wildflowers providing essential nectar for our precious pollinators. The bees are practically throwing rave parties back here. And the pond? That's a crucial wetland habitat. The local amphibian population is ecstatic, I assure you. I've heard some rather enthusiastic croaking lately." Priscilla's face was rapidly approaching the color of her prize-winning begonias. "This is a blatant act of defiance, Henderson. You know perfectly well we voted to annex this portion of your property for the community pickleball courts." "Ah, yes, the pickleball courts," I said, feigning a thoughtful expression. "Such a vital addition to our already amenity-rich community. I mean, between the gated entrance and the meticulously manicured shrubbery, what more could one possibly need? However," I continued, my voice taking on a more serious tone, "after careful consideration and the sudden, rather miraculous appearance of several endangered, possibly, species, I've decided to dedicate this land to a higher purpose." Priscilla's eyes narrowed to slits. Endangered species? In your backyard? What? Did a unicorn wander in for a snack? You'd be surprised, Priscilla, I said with a mysterious smile. Nature works in mysterious ways. To fully appreciate the sheer audacity of my wildlife preserve, we need to rewind a bit, back to that fateful HOA meeting where this whole glorious mess began. I'd reluctantly dragged myself to the community clubhouse, a beige building that always smelled faintly of stale coffee and unfulfilled promises. Priscilla, looking like she'd just stepped out of a country club magazine, was holding court, presenting her grand vision for the pickleball courts. As you all know, she'd announced, her voice radiating self-importance, our community lacks sufficient recreational facilities. After much deliberation, the board has identified a prime location for new pickleball courts, the underutilized area at the rear of Mr. Henderson's property. My hand shot up like a startled prairie dog. Excuse me? Underutilized? That's my backyard, and I utilize it quite a bit for, backyardy things, like contemplating the existential dread of lawn maintenance. Bob, bless his perpetually unimpressed heart, muttered, "It just looks like a bunch of overgrown grass to me." That overgrown grass, I retorted, trying to keep the sarcasm out of my voice, and failing miserably, provides essential privacy screening and is home to a thriving ecosystem of... Well, it's my business what lives back there. Let's just say there are creatures who prefer a slightly less regimented environment. Priscilla, bless her rule-obsessed soul, wasn't having any of it. The community voted overwhelmingly in favor of these courts, Mr. Henderson. Your personal preferences must take a back seat to the greater good of Prestige Lakes Estates. The vote, I distinctly remembered, was very close, and Priscilla had likely swayed a few undecided members with promises of increased property values and exclusive pickleball lessons. But you're talking about taking a significant chunk of my deeded property, I protested. That's not a community amenity, that's a land grab. It's practically eminent domain, but for pickleball. Susan, nodding vigorously, offered her insightful contribution. It's just a small strip, Barry. You'll barely notice it. A small strip that happens to be where I enjoy my morning coffee in peace, away from the enthusiasm of community pickleball, I emphasized. The thought of waking up to the rhythmic thwack-thwack of plastic balls at dawn fills me with a special kind of dread. Priscilla, clearly not swayed by my eloquent plea, simply stated, "The board has already approved the preliminary plans. We expect you to cooperate fully with the surveyors next week." That night, staring out at my backyard, the injustice of it all simmering in my veins, I knew I couldn't just roll over and let the pickleball hordes descend upon my tranquil existence. "They want my land for pickleball?" I muttered to the shadows. "Pickleball," as if the constant drone of leaf blowers and the incessant barking of miniature poodles wasn't enough noise pollution. No, there has to be a better way. My gaze drifted across the slightly wild expanse of my yard. "They think it's underutilized?" A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. "I'll show them. Underutilized." The idea hit me like a rogue pickleball to the face. A wildlife preserve. It was perfect. It was environmentally conscious. It was a massive inconvenience for the HOA. And it had the added bonus of being utterly ridiculous. I immediately dove into research, surrounding myself with books on local flora and fauna, dog-eared field guides, and maps of my property that suddenly looked a lot more strategically important. A quick call to my friend Dave, a man who appreciated my particular brand of chaotic brilliance, confirmed I wasn't completely insane, though he did have his doubts. "So, how'd the Gestapo meeting go?" Dave had asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "They want to seize my land for pickleball courts, Dave. Pickleball!" Dave's laughter echoed through the phone. No way, seriously? Dead serious. But I have a plan. A glorious, slightly insane plan. Oh boy, do tell. I'm turning my backyard into a national wildlife preserve. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Then, Dave's voice, laced with a mixture of amusement and concern, said, You're going to do what now? The next few days were a flurry of activity. Operation Backyard Biodiversity was officially underway. I stopped mowing in designated habitat zones, strategically scattered birdseed like I was feeding a small army of feathered friends, and even attempted to build a birdhouse mansion out of scrap wood, which looked more like a dilapidated shack for very discerning squirrels. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a sweet but perpetually bewildered woman who tended her roses with the precision of a brain surgeon, peered over the fence one afternoon. "Barry, dear," she said, her brow furrowed with concern, "are you all right? Your yard is looking rather untamed." "Perfectly fine, Mrs. Gable," I chirped, wiping sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. "Just encouraging the local wildlife. You know, doing my part for the ecosystem." Mrs. Gable looked at me with an expression that suggested she suspected I'd finally succumbed to the siren call of madness. "Right then," she said slowly, before retreating back to the orderly world of her rose bushes. The real fun began when the surveyors arrived. 2 guys in bright orange vests looking thoroughly unimpressed with their assignment. They unfolded their maps, squinted at the neatly marked property lines, and then looked at my backyard with expressions of utter confusion. "This can't be right," one of them muttered, scratching his head. "The plans clearly show a manicured lawn here." "Looks more like a jungle to me," his partner replied, swatting away a particularly persistent mosquito. "What's with all the bird feeders? And is that a scarecrow wearing a bathrobe?" It was a wildlife observation post. "And this sign?" The first surveyor pointed to my official wetland habitat marker. "Official designated wetland habitat? What wetland?" He gestured towards my small, muddy pond, which was currently being enthusiastically explored by a very large, very vocal bullfrog. "Maybe Henderson took up extreme gardening?" the second surveyor suggested, stifling a laugh. They tried to set up their equipment, but their efforts were constantly thwarted by the local fauna. Birds kept landing on their tripods. A particularly bold squirrel attempted to abscond with their measuring tape, and the bullfrog let out a series of booming croaks every time they got close to the pond. It was a symphony of suburban chaos. The next HOA meeting was a sight to behold. Priscilla, her face a mask of barely contained fury, addressed me directly. "Henderson! The surveyors couldn't even do their job. What is the meaning of this ridiculous charade?" "Charade? Priscilla, I'm deadly serious about this," I replied, my voice full of earnest conviction. "My land is now a protected habitat. I even saw a rather distinguished-looking earthworm yesterday, possibly endangered. I'm thinking of naming him." Bob snorted. "An earthworm? That's your idea of wildlife?" "It's a start, Bob," I declared. "Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is a thriving ecosystem. Besides," I leaned in conspiratorially, "I've been doing some research. Did you know that our area is a crucial migratory path for the, spotted garden snail?" I'd completely made that up, but I delivered it with such unwavering confidence that a few people actually looked thoughtful. Priscilla's face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. "This is absurd. We have a community to think about. Pickleball enthusiasts are waiting with bated breath." "And the snails?" I countered, my voice rising with mock indignation. "Aren't their needs just as important? Think of the children, Priscilla. What kind of message are we sending if we prioritize recreational sports over the delicate balance of nature?" Surprisingly, my backyard actually started attracting some wildlife. Not exactly the majestic bald eagles and graceful deer I'd envisioned, but wildlife nonetheless. A family of raccoons, looking like furry little bandits, took up residence in my birdhouse mansion, much to the dismay of the local bird population. A flock of particularly noisy geese, honking with the enthusiasm of a marching band, decided my muddy pond was the perfect vacation spot. And the squirrel population exploded. Well, I mused to myself one afternoon, watching the raccoons rummage through my overturned compost bin, I suppose they are technically wildlife, though I'm not entirely sure squatting is the term I'd use for their residency. A phone call with Dave confirmed his continued amusement. "So, how's the preserve coming along?" he asked, barely containing his laughter. "It's thriving," I reported. "I have a family of raccoons who seem to think my birdhouse is a 5-star hotel, and a flock of geese that are louder than a heavy metal concert. Plus, I think the squirrels are plotting world domination from my oak tree." "Sounds idyllic," Dave chuckled. "It's certainly lively," I conceded. The HOA, predictably, tried to intervene. They sent Bob, armed with a clipboard and a stern expression, to issue a landscaping enforcement officer, which was clearly just Bob in a slightly too tight polo shirt, to deliver a notice of violation. "Henderson!" Bob bellowed from the edge of my habitat zone. "I have a notice of violation regarding the unkempt state of your property." Just then, Agnes, the particularly territorial goose who seemed to have appointed herself the guardian of my pond, let out a ferocious hiss and flapped her wings menacingly at Bob. He froze in his tracks, looking like a deer caught in headlights. "Oh, careful there, Bob," I called out, strolling over with a bag of birdseed. "That's Agnes. She's very protective of her goslings. Wouldn't want to startle her." Bob, backing away slowly, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, stammered, "Goslings? You have geese now." "It's a wildlife preserve, Bob," I exclaimed, scattering the birdseed. "Expect the unexpected. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to ensure Agnes has enough organic, locally sourced goose feed." Bob retreated hastily, the violation notice clutched forgotten in his hand. At this point, I decided to fully embrace my role as the eccentric protector of the Henderson National Wildlife Preserve. I started sporting a khaki vest and a wide-brimmed hat, carrying binoculars everywhere, even indoors, and giving impromptu tours of my preserve to bemused neighbors, pointing out the unique ecological niches and the delicate balance of nature with a completely straight face. I even started posting hilarious updates on the neighborhood social media group about the goings-on at the HNWLP. My posts included gems like, "Breaking news from the HNWLP, suspected sighting of a rare eastern suburban earthworm, more updates to follow," and "Exciting developments. Our resident raccoon family has welcomed 3 adorable new kits. Please respect their privacy during this sensitive time." Then, the local media got wind of the story. Apparently, a disgruntled pickleball enthusiast had tipped them off about the neighbor who's holding up progress with a ridiculous backyard zoo. A news crew showed up at my front door, and I, naturally, was ready for my close-up. I gave an enthusiastic and slightly exaggerated interview, portraying myself as a champion of local wildlife, standing bravely against the tyranny of the HOA. Priscilla, I later heard, nearly choked on her morning mimosa while watching the segment. The HOA, predictably, lawyered up. Priscilla and the board held an emergency meeting with their poor, increasingly exasperated lawyer, trying to find some legal loophole to force me to dismantle my preserve. The lawyer, a young woman named Sarah, who looked like she regretted ever choosing a career in HOA law, patiently listened as Priscilla described the unbearable nuisance of my thriving, if slightly chaotic, backyard ecosystem. But Sarah, bless her legal mind, pointed out that declaring my property a wildlife preserve, while unconventional, didn't actually violate any specific landscaping regulations. Just when it seemed like a stalemate, an unexpected ally emerged. A representative from a local wildlife conservation organization, a kind woman named Carol, showed up at my door one afternoon, having seen my interview on the news. To my surprise, she was actually quite impressed by the biodiversity I'd inadvertently created. She even offered to partner with me, providing guidance on native plant species and sustainable habitat management. Suddenly, my ridiculous act of defiance was starting to look almost legitimate. The climax of this suburban saga arrived in the form of the annual HOA picnic, a joyous celebration of, well, whatever it is that HOAs celebrate. I decided to make a dramatic entrance, bringing Carol with me, and even managing to coax one of the more docile raccoons, okay, it was Dave's very well-behaved dog, Kevin, in a slightly too small raccoon costume, on a leash. "Fellow residents of Prestige Lakes Estates," I announced, addressing the bewildered crowd, Carol standing proudly by my side. "I have an important announcement. Thanks to the overwhelming success of the Henderson National Wildlife Preserve and its newfound partnership with the Tri-County Wildlife Preservation Society, my land will remain a protected habitat." Priscilla, her face a mask of utter disbelief, sputtered, "This is outrageous! You can't just—" Carol stepped forward, a calm but authoritative smile on her face. "Actually, Mrs. Lancaster, Mr. Henderson has created a valuable ecological asset for our community. We're even considering it for official recognition." Just then, in a moment of perfect comedic timing, the geese from my pond, apparently drawn by the aroma of barbecue, waddled over and started honking loudly, effectively drowning out Priscilla's protests. Kevin the raccoon, startled by the sudden noise, lunged playfully at Priscilla's perfectly coiffed poodle, creating a scene of utter chaos. In the end, the pickleball courts were built on a different, less ecologically significant, and less privately owned patch of land. My backyard remained a slightly wild but officially recognized, complete with a small official-looking sign, wildlife preserve. Priscilla still shot me daggers every time I saw her, but the rest of the neighborhood seemed to find the whole thing rather amusing. Life in Prestige Lakes Estates had definitely gotten a whole lot wilder, and I wouldn't have it any other way. "So, no pickleball then?" Dave asked during our weekly debriefing call. "Nope," I replied, looking out at my slightly chaotic but undeniably thriving backyard. Just the soothing sounds of chirping birds and the occasional honking goose. Turns out sometimes the best way to fight bureaucracy is with a bit of strategic biodiversity. "I still can't believe you convinced them about the spotted garden snail," Dave chuckled. "You'd be surprised what people will believe when you say it with enough confidence and wear a khaki vest," I said with a wink. A few weeks later, I was sitting in my lawn chair, binoculars in hand, enjoying the peace and quiet of my wildlife preserve. The raccoons were napping in the birdhouse, the geese were peacefully preening by the pond, and the squirrels were, no doubt, plotting their next acorn heist. Suddenly, I spotted something new waddling out from behind a particularly large fern. It was brown, furry, and had a distinctively flat tail. "Well, I'll be," I muttered to myself, a mixture of surprise and a tiny bit of worry creeping into my voice. "Is that a beaver?" Looks like the Henderson National Wildlife Preserve was about to get a whole lot more interesting. And I had a feeling Priscilla was not going to be happy. But hey, at least it wasn't pickleball.